All her life, she believed the scar on her face was the result of a devastating house fire she had survived as a toddler. The constant bullying and curious stares made growing up difficult, leaving her to wonder why fate had chosen her to bear this visible burden. But one fateful day, while browsing through a newspaper, she stopped abruptly and frantically flipped back a few pages. What she saw made her blood run cold. Soon, she would uncover the true cause of the scar on her face, exposing the dark secret her evil parents had kept hidden for years. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. The Saturday morning sun filtered through the curtains of the Fisher family's living room, casting a warm glow on the scene within. Jessica Fisher, a 12-year-old girl with fiery red hair, sat curled up on the couch, her fingers flying across her phone screen as she texted her best friend, Sophie. The gentle tapping of her thumbs on the glass surface was accompanied by the rhythmic sound of her father, James Fisher, working on a broken cupboard door nearby. James, a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, furrowed his brow in concentration as he adjusted the hinges. Every so often he'd glance up at Jessica, a small smile playing on his lips as he watched his daughter engrossed in her digital conversation. Catherine Fisher, Jessica's mother, had just finished her morning cleaning routine. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wiped her hands on her apron as she made her way towards the front door. "I'm just going to check the mailbox and grab the newspaper," she called out to her family. Jessica barely looked up from her phone, offering a distracted "Okay, Mum" in response. James nodded, his attention still focused on the stubborn cupboard door. A few minutes later, the front door creaked open again. This time, Jessica glanced up from her phone, curiosity piqued by the rustling sound of paper. Catherine entered the living room, her arms laden with a stack of mail, magazines, and the daily newspaper. She made her way to the coffee table, carefully setting down her haul before beginning to sort through it. As Catherine organized the various items, her eyes fell on the calendar hanging on the wall. "Oh, Jessica," she said, turning to her daughter, "don't forget it's Saturday, May 25th. You have your dermatologist appointment today." Jessica's eyes widened in surprise. She had completely forgotten about the appointment. Quickly, she typed out a message to Sophie and locked her phone, setting it aside. She watched as her mother settled into her usual morning routine, unfolding the newspaper and beginning to read. With a sigh, Jessica stood up from the couch, stretching her arms above her head. "How much longer do I need to keep going to the dermatologist?" she asked, a hint of frustration in her voice. "I've been going there for as long as I can remember, and the scar on my face is still the same." James looked up from his work, his expression softening as he met his daughter's gaze. "I know it's frustrating, sweetheart," he said in a calming, fatherly tone, "but even if we can't fully remove the scar, it has been smoothing out slightly every year." Jessica rolled her eyes, her frustration evident. "Yeah, just ever so slightly," she muttered. Then, almost without thinking, she added, "Maybe it would be better if I got cosmetic surgery or something." The room fell silent. Catherine looked up from her newspaper, her eyes wide with shock. James froze, his screwdriver hovering mid-air. They both stared at Jessica, their expressions a mix of surprise and concern. Jessica felt a pang of guilt wash over her as she realized the impact of her words. I saw it on social media," she explained hesitantly. "There were girls getting facial reconstruction for their 18th birthday presents from their parents." James set down his tools, giving Jessica his full attention. "Sweetheart, you're only 12, he said gently but firmly. "You don't need any of that." Jessica's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she pressed on. "I did some research," she said, her voice growing more confident. "There's even plastic surgery for children, you know. I saw it on YouTube and the transformations were remarkable. You don't have to wait until 18 to do it." Catherine folded her newspaper as she considered her daughter's words. "Well," she said carefully, "that must require a lot of money. If we could afford it, we might have considered it." She paused, exchanging a glance with James. "But it's not just about the money, Jessica. It's a big decision and you're still so young." Jessica groaned slightly, feeling defeated. She had hoped her parents might be more open to the idea, but their reactions made it clear that cosmetic surgery was off the table, at least for now. Catherine picked up her newspaper again, flipping to the middle section. Suddenly she froze, her face turning serious. Jessica noticed the change in her mother's posture and expression. "What happened, Mom?" she asked, curiosity piqued. "What are you reading?" James looked up from the cupboard, noticing the frozen expression on Catherine's face. "Yeah, honey, what's going on? What did you see?" But Catherine quickly closed the newspaper, rolling it up and clutching it to her chest. "Oh, it's nothing," she said, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Just some boring news." She stood up abruptly, walking to the kitchen bin where she dumped the newspaper. Jessica watched her mother's strange behavior with a mixture of confusion and amusement. "Come on, Mom," she said, chuckling. "You can't make such a mystery out of it. What was in there?" She exchanged a look with her father, raising an eyebrow. Mom's being extra right now. James shrugged, offering a small chuckle in response to Jessica's comment, though his eyes betrayed a hint of concern as he looked at Catherine. Catherine cleared her throat, composing herself. "Jessica, you should get ready to catch the bus," she said, changing the subject. "There's a chance it could come earlier today." Jessica sighed, recognizing her mother's attempt to deflect. Okay, she said, standing up from the couch. As she made her way towards the stairs, James called out to her once more. "Remember, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm and reassuring, "you're beautiful, just as you are." Jessica smiled slightly at her father's words, but as she climbed the stairs, she couldn't help but think about how much easier life would be without the scar on her face. If only she could have a smooth, unblemished complexion, like the girls she saw on social media. She'd be able to post more pictures, be as confident as her other friends. Jessica entered her bedroom, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The familiar surroundings, the pale blue walls adorned with posters of her favorite bands, the desk cluttered with school books and art supplies, the cozy window seat where she often curled up to read, usually brought her comfort. Today, however, they felt like a reminder of a life she sometimes wished she could change. She walked to her closet, pulling out a comfortable outfit for her appointment. As she changed, her eyes inadvertently caught her reflection in the full-length mirror on the back of her door. The scar on her face, a constant presence since she could remember, seemed to stand out more than ever today. It stretched across her left cheek, a slightly raised pinkish mark that told a story she knew by heart but couldn't truly remember. Jessica sighed, turning away from the mirror. She grabbed her phone from where she'd left it on her bed, quickly typing out a message to Sophie. "Hey, gotta go to the dermatologist, talk later." She slipped the phone into her purse, along with her wallet. From her desk drawer, she retrieved a slightly worn envelope containing her medical records. It was a familiar routine, one she'd been through countless times before. As she made her way back downstairs, Jessica couldn't help but replay her father's words in her mind. "You're beautiful as you are, sweetheart." She appreciated the sentiment, she really did. But sometimes, she wished they could understand how hard it was to feel beautiful when every mirror, every photograph, every curious glance from a stranger reminded her of what made her different. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, Jessica noticed that Catherine was nowhere to be seen. James, who had finished with the cupboard, looked up as she entered the room. "Your mum went to the bathroom," he explained, noticing Jessica's questioning look. "Before you go, remember to ask the doctor about the medication, okay? Make sure to tell him about any side effects you've been feeling, and ask how long you'll need to continue these checkups, what their expectations are." Jessica nodded, grateful for her father's reminders. She too wanted answers to these questions. How long would this be her reality? When would she see real, noticeable changes? As James gathered his tools and headed towards the garage, mentioning something about needing to work on the car, Jessica found herself drawn to the kitchen. Her eyes landed on the trash bin where her mother had discarded the newspaper earlier. Curiosity gnawed at her. What had her mother seen that had caused such a strange reaction? She walked over to the bin, half expecting to find the newspaper sitting right on top. To her surprise, it was gone. Jessica frowned, puzzled by its absence. Had her mother taken it out of the house entirely? That seemed like an overreaction to whatever she had read, but she quickly dismissed the thought. It was probably just her mother's overprotective nature kicking in again. Jessica made her way back to the front door. As she stepped outside, the warm May air brushed against her cheeks. She started the familiar walk to the bus stop, her mind wandering to her upcoming appointment. It had become a monthly ritual: the visit to the dermatologist, the examination of her scars, the renewal of her topical creams prescription. At first, her parents had accompanied her to every appointment. But as she grew older and the visits became routine, Jessica had started going on her own. It was a small act of independence, one that made her feel a bit more grown up. The bus stop came into view just as the familiar rumble of an approaching vehicle reached her ears. Perfect timing. Jessica boarded the bus, choosing a seat near the back by the window. As the bus pulled away from the curb, she settled in for the ride, her thoughts a swirling mix of hope and resignation. Halfway through the journey, a group of kids about her age boarded the bus. Jessica didn't recognize them. Probably from a different school, she thought. But as they passed by her seat, she noticed their curious glances, the way they whispered among themselves, the barely concealed laughter. Jessica sighed, turning her face towards the window. She was all too familiar with this kind of reaction. Throughout her life, she'd endured her fair share of stares and mockery. It never got easier, but she'd learned to steel herself against it. As the bus continued its route, Jessica found herself imagining a different life. One where she could go out with friends on a Saturday without feeling self-conscious. One where she could post selfies without agonizing over angles and filters. If only she had a face unmarred by scars, she thought, she could live that carefree life she saw her classmates enjoying. A sudden wave of anger and resentment washed over her. It wasn't fair. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't done anything to deserve it. And yet here she was, forever marked by an accident she couldn't even remember. But as quickly as the anger came, it subsided, replaced by a familiar sense of resignation. She knew she should be grateful. After all, she was alive. She had loving parents, a best friend in Sophie. It was better than nothing at all. Her thoughts drifted to the story her parents had told her countless times, how lucky they all were to have survived the house fire that had left her scarred. It was a reminder of how close she'd come to losing everything. And yet, sometimes she couldn't help but wonder if a life without the constant struggle of living with her scars might have been easier. As the bus approached her stop, Jessica gathered her things, pushing these heavy thoughts to the back of her mind. Jessica stepped off the bus, the familiar surroundings of the neighborhood around the dermatologist's clinic coming into view. The red brick exterior of the building stood out against the bright sky, the large sign near the entrance displaying the doctor's name and operating hours. She'd made this journey so many times that she could probably walk it blindfolded. As she was about to cross the street towards the clinic, something caught her eye. Just across the road was a small kiosk, its shelves lined with magazines and newspapers. Among them, Jessica recognized the same newspaper her mum had been reading that morning, the one that had caused such a strange reaction. Curiosity got the better of her. She knew she had some time before her appointment. The doctor was always running a bit late. Making a split-second decision, Jessica crossed the road towards the kiosk instead. The old man behind the counter greeted her with a friendly nod as she approached. Jessica returned the gesture, her eyes scanning the stacks of newspapers until she found the one she was looking for. She purchased a copy, the coins in her wallet jingling as she handed them over. As the old man gave her the change, Jessica glanced at the front page. The main headline was about some recent political and economic event. Nothing that seemed particularly interesting or shocking. She frowned slightly, wondering what could have upset her mother so much. Tucking the newspaper under her arm, Jessica crossed the street again and entered the clinic building. The familiar smell of antiseptic and the quiet hum of the air conditioning greeted her as she pushed through the glass doors. At the reception desk, Jessica went through the usual routine of signing in and confirming her appointment. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, informed her that the doctor was running about 10 minutes behind schedule, but assured her that as the first patient, her wait wouldn't be too long. Jessica nodded, unsurprised by the news. She made her way to the waiting area, settling into a corner seat. Opening the newspaper, she began to flip through its pages, more out of a desire to kill time than genuine interest in its contents. As she buried herself in the newspaper, Jessica felt a strange sense of peace. With the pages obscuring her face, she could pretend, just for a moment, that no one could see the scar that had defined so much of her life. It was a small comfort, but one she clung to nonetheless. She skimmed through the various sections, local news, sports, entertainment, not really paying much attention to any particular article. Her mind wandered back to her mother's reaction that morning. What could have been in these pages that made her so shocked? Almost without realizing it, Jessica found herself on the page dedicated to missing persons. Her eyes scanned the various faces and stories, each one a tragedy in its own right. She was about to flip past it when something made her pause. There in the corner of the page was a photo that made her heart skip a beat. It was a picture of a little girl with fiery red hair that looked startlingly similar to her own. The girl's facial features were eerily familiar, like looking at a younger version of herself. The only difference was the clear, unmarred cheek, where Jessica's own face bore her scar. For a moment, Jessica felt a wave of empathy wash over her. How heartbreaking it must be for this girl's family, she thought. She had never paid much attention to missing person ads before, but now, seeing a child who could almost be her twin, it hit close to home. It could be anyone, she realized. Any family could find themselves in this terrible situation. As she stared at the photo, a strange feeling began to creep over her. There was something about this girl, something beyond just the physical resemblance, that tugged at her. But before she could dwell on it further, she heard the doctor's voice calling her name. Folding the newspaper and tucking it into her bag, Jessica stood up. She pushed the thoughts of the missing girl to the back of her mind, focusing instead on the appointment ahead. Jessica entered the examination room, greeted by the familiar sight of Dr. Smith, a kind-faced man in his 50s with salt-and-pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He smiled warmly as she took a seat on the examination table. "How are you doing today, Jessica?" Dr. Smith asked, his voice carrying the gentle tone of someone who had years of experience dealing with young patients. Jessica managed a small smile. "I'm okay," she replied. "The topical creams you prescribed last time have run out, and it's time for our regular checkup." Dr. Smith nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "All right, let's take a look then, shall we?" He guided Jessica to lie back on the examination table, adjusting the bright overhead light. With gentle hands, he began to examine her face, his eyes scrutinizing every inch of the scar tissue. Jessica tried to remain still, but she couldn't help feeling a bit nervous. These examinations always made her feel vulnerable, exposed. "The skin texture is improving," Dr. Smith murmured, more to himself than to Jessica. "The collagen seems to be building up nicely, and the pigmentation has lightened somewhat." Jessica's heart leaped at his words. "Really?" she asked, unable to keep the hope out of her voice. I haven't really noticed much change." Dr. Smith smiled reassuringly. "The changes are gradual, but they're definitely there. We'll continue with the prescribed topical cream. It's doing its job." Jessica nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of disappointment. Gradual changes weren't enough. She wanted more. Taking a deep breath, she decided to voice the thoughts that had been plaguing her. "Dr. Smith," she began hesitantly, Is there maybe another treatment plan that would work quicker? Like, maybe cosmetic surgery or something?" To her surprise, Dr. Smith didn't seem shocked by her question. His expression remained neutral as he considered her words. "Well, Jessica," he said carefully, "there are several options we could consider. Laser therapy or cosmetic surgery could potentially yield faster results." Jessica's eyes widened with hope, but Dr. Smith held up a hand, tempering her expectations. "However," he continued, "these treatments come with their own set of challenges. They're considerably more expensive than the topical treatments we're using now. They can also be quite painful, and the results aren't instant." He went on to explain the potential risks and side effects. things Jessica hadn't considered when she'd seen the before and after comparisons on social media. The recovery period, the dietary restrictions, the risk of complications. It all sounded far more daunting than she'd imagined. "Oh," Jessica said softly, her enthusiasm deflating. I didn't realize all that." Dr. Smith's expression softened. "It's good that you're thinking about your options, Jessica, but for now, I believe sticking with the topical cream is our best course of action. The progress is slow, but it's steady and safe." Jessica nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Okay," she agreed. "We'll stick with the cream for now." Dr. Smith smiled encouragingly. "Let me show you something," he said, turning to his computer. He pulled up a series of photos, images of Jessica's face from when she was just 3 years old up to the present day. As Jessica looked at the progression of images, she could see the subtle changes Dr. Smith had been talking about. The angry red of the scar had faded to a softer pink. The raised tissue had flattened somewhat. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was progress. "You've come a long way, Jessica," Dr. Smith said gently, "and we'll keep working until you're happy with the results." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to believe him, to feel as optimistic as he sounded, but a part of her couldn't help but wonder if she'd ever truly be happy with her appearance. As the appointment wound down, Dr. Smith asked for permission to take her picture, as he did at every checkup. Jessica agreed, sitting still as he snapped a photo under the bright examination light. While Dr. Smith stepped out to prepare her prescription, Jessica found herself alone in the room. Her eyes drifted back to the computer screen, where her younger self stared back at her. The 3-year-old in the photo looked so small, so vulnerable. Jessica tried to remember being that age, but her memories were hazy at best. Almost without thinking, she pulled out the newspaper from her bag, turning once again to the missing persons page. She held up the photo of the missing girl next to the image on the computer screen. A chill ran down her spine as she noticed the similarities. The shape of the nose, the curve of the brow, the set of the lips. Even with the scar distorting her features, Jessica could see a resemblance that went beyond coincidence. Her mind raced. She tried to recall photos of herself at that age, pictures her parents must have taken. But strangely, she realized she had never seen any photos of herself younger than 3. How odd, she thought. Surely her parents would have taken baby pictures. The sound of Dr. Smith returning snapped Jessica out of her thoughts. She quickly folded the newspaper, shoving it back into her bag. As he handed her the prescription, Jessica felt a question forming on her lips, one she had never thought to ask before. "Dr. Smith," Jessica began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I ask you something about my scar?" The doctor paused, his kind eyes meeting hers. "Of course, Jessica. What would you like to know?" Jessica took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Why is it only on my face? I mean, if I was in a house fire, shouldn't there be scars on other parts of my body too? My parents said we were lucky to be alive, that I was found in the rubble of our burning house. But the scars are only on my face. The doctor leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Well, Jessica, this is the first time I'm hearing about this. Your parents informed me it was caused by a house fire, but I didn't know about the exact details. Thank you for sharing that with me." He paused, choosing his words carefully. The face does have thinner skin, which could explain why it was more severely affected. But you're right, in most house fire cases, we would expect to see burns on other parts of the body as well. Jessica felt a knot forming in her stomach. Dr. Smith must have noticed her troubled expression, because his tone softened further. "Jessica, I don't know the exact circumstances of the fire or how it affected you. These are questions your parents might be better equipped to answer." Jessica nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She had hoped the doctor might have some insight, some explanation that would make everything make sense. Instead, she was left with more questions than answers. Seeing her crestfallen expression, Dr. Smith leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Jessica, I want you to remember something. You are a strong, beautiful young woman. Your scar is part of your story, but it doesn't define you. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Jessica offered a small smile, appreciating the doctor's kindness. She accepted the prescribed topical cream and the sealed envelope containing her medical records. As she stepped out of the examination room, her mind swirled with the weight of the new information. At the clinic's admin desk, Jessica settled the payment for her checkup and medication. Stepping outside, she was met with a wave of warm air, a stark contrast to the clinic's cool, sterile atmosphere. Jessica boarded the bus as she arrived at the bus stop. In the back seat, Jessica pulled out the newspaper again. This time she didn't just glance at the missing persons page, she read it thoroughly. The girl's name was Jenny Clark, and she had gone missing from an orphanage 10 years ago. Jessica's heart pounded as she read the details. The timing, the age, the physical description, it all seemed to line up too perfectly to be a coincidence. At the bottom of the article was a personal contact number, separate from the standard "Call 911" message under the photo. Without really thinking about why, Jessica took out her phone and saved the number. She told herself it was just in case she heard anything about the girl, feeling an inexplicable connection to Jenny's story. As the bus neared her stop, Jessica's mind churned with a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Her scarred face, the alternative treatment, the missing girl, it all wove together in a haze of uncertainty. The familiar streets passed by unnoticed, as she sank deeper into her thoughts, wondering if she should have been more grateful. After all, she lived a far better life than Jenny Clark. Didn't she? The bus came to a halt, and Jessica stepped off, making her way toward home. As she walked, a sudden awareness prickled at her senses. A group of kids clustered on the sidewalk just a few houses away. Her stomach tightened as recognition set in. It was the same group from the bus earlier. Their eyes locked onto her as she approached, and Jessica could hear their whispers and stifled laughter. She tried to keep her head high, to ignore them as she had done countless times before, but their presence made her skin crawl with anxiety. Just as she was about to pass them, one of the girls, clearly the leader of the group, reached out and grabbed Jessica's shoulder, forcing her to turn towards them. "Well, well," the girl sneered, her eyes gleaming with malice. "If it isn't the freak show." Jessica's heart raced, a mix of fear and anger coursing through her. "Leave me alone," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't even know you guys." The group laughed, the sound grating on Jessica's nerves. "Oh, but we know something about you," another girl chimed in. "I bet all your friends at school just love hanging out with that face." Something inside Jessica snapped. Years of pent-up frustration and hurt bubbled to the surface. Without thinking, she reached out and grabbed a fistful of the lead girl's hair, yanking hard. The girl yelped in pain and surprise, her eyes widening with shock before narrowing in anger. "You little bitch," she snarled, turning to one of the boys in the group. "Teach her a lesson." Before Jessica could react, the boy's hand shot out, striking her left cheek, right where her scar was. Pain exploded across her face, the tender skin burning and throbbing. Tears sprang to her eyes, but Jessica blinked them back furiously, refusing to show weakness. She was about to lunge at the group, her fists clenched and ready to fight, when a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Hey, what's going on here?" Jessica's heart leapt with relief as she recognized her father's voice. The group of kids scattered like leaves in the wind, clearly not wanting to face an angry adult. James rushed to Jessica's side, his face a mask of concern. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" "Did they hurt you?" Unable to hold back her tears any longer, Jessica threw herself into her father's arms, sobbing into his chest. James held her tight, one hand gently stroking her hair as he murmured soothing words. After a moment, James pulled back slightly, examining Jessica's face. His expression darkened as he saw the red mark blooming on her cheek. "Let's get you inside," he said softly. "We'll put some ice on that." As they walked the short distance to their house, Jessica leaned heavily on her father, the events of the day catching up with her. She felt drained, both physically and emotionally. Inside, James guided Jessica to a chair at the dining table before heading to the kitchen. He returned moments later with an ice pack wrapped in a soft towel. Gently, he pressed it against Jessica's cheek, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," he said softly. "Those kids had no right to treat you that way." Jessica nodded, wincing slightly at the pressure on her tender skin. The coolness of the ice was soothing, but it did little to ease the ache in her heart. Years of bullying, of feeling different and isolated, seemed to crash down on her all at once. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did this have to happen to me?" James's expression softened, his free hand reaching out to clasp Jessica's. "I wish I had an answer for you, sweetheart, but what I do know is that you are strong and brave and beautiful, scars and all." "Don't call me beautiful. Every adult keeps saying that, but it's not true." Just then, Catherine burst into the room, her face pale with worry. "What happened?" she demanded, rushing to Jessica's side. "I heard crying. Are you okay, honey?" As James explained the situation, Catherine's expressions cycled through shock, anger, and finally, deep sadness. She knelt beside Jessica's chair, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "Oh, my sweet girl," she murmured. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, Jessica allowed herself to be comforted by her parents' presence, but as the initial shock of the incident began to fade, her mind drifted back to the events at the doctor's office, to the newspaper article that had raised so many questions. Taking a deep breath, Jessica pulled away from her mother's embrace. "The appointment," she said, her voice steadier now. "You wanted to know how it went." Catherine nodded, clearly relieved to have something else to focus on. "Yes, of course. What did the doctor say?" Jessica hesitated for a moment, unsure how to broach the subject of alternative treatments. Finally, she decided to just be direct. "He said the topical creams are working, but slowly. He mentioned that there are other options we could consider in the future, like laser therapy." She watched her parents carefully as she spoke, noting the way they exchanged a quick glance. "He showed me pictures," Jessica continued, "of how my scar has changed since I was 3. That's when I first started seeing him, right?" Catherine's face paled slightly, and Jessica noticed her mother's hands trembling ever so slightly. "Pictures?" Catherine repeated, her voice higher than usual. "What kind of pictures?" Jessica frowned, confused by her mother's reaction. "Just the ones they take at every checkup," she explained. "Mum, why are you acting so strange? You've been weird all day." James cleared his throat, clearly trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Let's focus on what the doctor said about treatment options," he said. "When the time comes, we'll talk to him ourselves about these alternatives. But for now, we just don't have the money for expensive treatments. We're saving for your high school tuition, remember?" Jessica felt a wave of disappointment wash over her. She had known it was a long shot, but hearing it confirmed still hurt. Nodding silently, she stood up, suddenly feeling the need to be alone. "I'm going to my room," she mumbled, grabbing her bag and heading for the stairs. As she climbed, she could hear her parents' hushed voices behind her, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. In the sanctuary of her room, Jessica threw herself onto her bed, feeling utterly drained. The events of the day swirled in her mind, the strange newspaper article, the doctor's appointment, the confrontation with the bullies. It all felt like too much to process. Reaching for her phone, Jessica's fingers hovered over Sophie's contact. She needed to talk to someone, to share the weight of everything she was feeling. But as she was about to type out a message, her eyes fell on the number she had saved earlier, the contact from the missing persons ad. Almost without thinking, Jessica opened a new message and typed, "Hi, my name is Jessica. I saw the missing person article in today's newspaper." Her thumb lingered over the send button for what felt like an eternity. A part of her knew this was irrational. What did she hope to accomplish? She had no information about the girl. Yet another part of her, fueled by a strange, inexplicable emptiness that craved connection, pushed her forward. Taking a deep breath, Jessica hit send. As soon as the message was gone, regret washed over her. What had she done? What if whoever was on the other end of that number thought she was some kind of prankster? She groaned, burying her face in her pillow. Stupid, 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 she muttered to herself. But the message was sent and there was nothing she could do about it now. All she could do was wait and see if there would be a response, and try to make sense of the growing feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. Jessica was still berating herself for sending the text when she heard a soft knock on her door. She quickly locked her phone screen as the door opened, revealing Catherine and James. Their expressions were a mixture of concern and apology. "Hey, sweetheart," James said softly. "Can we come in?" Jessica nodded, sitting up on her bed as her parents entered the room. Catherine perched on the edge of the bed while James leaned against the desk. "We wanted to apologize," Catherine began. "I know I've been acting strangely today. It's just, well, it's that time of the month and my hormones are all over the place." Jessica couldn't help but scoff, though she managed a small smile. "Mom, seriously?" James chuckled, shaking his head. "What your mother is trying to say is that we're sorry if we've been a bit off today. We don't want you to lose hope, Jess. We want you to have the best treatment possible, and we're going to work hard and save up so that you can get that laser therapy when the time is right." Jessica felt a warmth spread through her chest at her father's words. "Really?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Catherine nodded, reaching out to squeeze Jessica's hand. "Really, we love you so much, sweetheart. We only want what's best for you." Feeling overwhelmed with emotion, Jessica leaned forward to hug her mother. As she did so, Catherine's eyes fell on Jessica's bag, where the corner of the newspaper was visible. Catherine's body stiffened, her arms dropping from around Jessica. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice suddenly tense. Jessica pulled back, confused by the abrupt change in her mother's demeanor. "The newspaper?" "I bought it at a kiosk near the doctor's office," she explained. "Why? What's wrong with it?" Catherine's face had gone pale, her eyes darting to James with a look of panic. James stepped forward, his expression suddenly serious. "Jessica, that newspaper, it's not appropriate for someone your age." Jessica stood up, frustration bubbling up inside her. "What? It's just a newspaper, not some adult magazine. What's going on? Why are you both acting so weird about this?" Catherine reached for the bag, but Jessica snatched it away. "No," Jessica said firmly. "I want to know what's going on. You've been acting strange all day, Mum. First, you freak out about the newspaper this morning, then about the photos at the doctor's office, and now this. What aren't you telling me?" The tension in the room was palpable. James and Catherine exchanged a look that Jessica couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of fear, guilt, and something else, something that made Jessica's heart race with apprehension. Before Jessica could say another thing, James swiftly moved forward and snatched the newspaper from her bag. His face was a mask of concern and something else. Fear. "Dad!" Jessica exclaimed, a surge of anger rising within her as she reached for the newspaper. "I'm not a little kid anymore. I can handle reading a newspaper. Why won't you trust me?" She demanded, "What are you doing? Give that back." James held the newspaper out of her reach. "Jessica, please, this isn't for you to read. We're your parents, and we know what's best for you." Jessica felt anger rising within her. "You're not making any sense." Catherine stood up, her face pale. "Jessica, honey, please try to understand. There are things in the world that you're not ready for yet. We're just trying to protect you." Jessica looked between her parents, confusion and frustration warring inside her. "Protect me from what? From the world news? You're not making any sense. I'm sick of everyone telling me what I can and can't do, what I can and can't know." The tension in the room was palpable. James and Catherine exchanged a look that Jessica couldn't quite decipher before they just left, the door closing behind them with a finality that echoed in Jessica's bones. She stood there, chest heaving, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. The room that had always been her sanctuary now felt like a prison. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone again. She needed to get out, needed to talk to someone who wouldn't treat her like a child. She dialed Sophie's number, each ring increasing her desperation. "Hello?" Sophie's voice came through, tinged with surprise. "Soph," Jessica's voice cracked. "I need to see you. I can't stay here right now. Can I come over? Maybe for a sleepover?" She could hear the concern in Sophie's voice. "Of course, Jess, what's wrong? You sound upset." "I'll explain when I get there," Jessica promised. I really need my best friend right now." As she ended the call, Jessica's eyes fell on her reflection in the mirror. The scar on her cheek seemed more prominent than ever. With a determined set to her jaw, she collected her tote bag from the shelves and threw clothes into her overnight bag, her movements fueled by a cocktail of anger and determination. Each item she packed felt like an act of defiance against the suffocating atmosphere that had descended upon her home. Her mind raced, piecing together the strange events of the day. The newspaper, her parents' bizarre reactions, the girl in the missing person ad who looked so eerily like her. It all swirled together in a dizzying whirlpool of questions and suspicions now. Jessica took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. The stairs creaked under her feet as she descended, each step feeling like a countdown to something monumental. She found her parents in the living room, their hushed whispers cutting off abruptly as she entered. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "I'm going to Sophie's," Jessica announced, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll take the bus." Her parents exchanged a look that sent a chill down Jessica's spine. It was a look laden with unspoken words and hidden meanings. Her father cleared his throat, glancing at the clock on the wall. "It's already 6 p.m., Jessica. It's getting late. We'll drive you." "No need," Jessica retorted, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. "I can take care of myself." Her mother stepped forward, her face a mask of remorse. "Sweetheart, I'm sorry, we overreacted earlier." She held out the newspaper, a peace offering that felt too little, too late. "Here, take it. We shouldn't have made such a fuss, Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Giving me back the newspaper doesn't fix anything. What's really going on? And don't tell me it's because of your period, Mom." Her parents launched into an explanation about financial stress and work pressures, their words washing over Jessica like a wave of white noise. It all sounded so rehearsed, so hollow. Her mother disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a glass of warm water. "Here, honey, this will help you calm down." Jessica accepted the glass, taking it more out of habit than genuine thirst. The warm water slid down her throat, soothing and grounding her in the present. With each sip, she felt some of the tension begin to leave her body. "Okay," she conceded. "You can drive me, but I want you to leave as soon as we arrive at Sophie's." They climbed into the car, and as James started to pull out of the driveway, Jessica's eyelids felt inexplicably heavy. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the familiar streets of her neighborhood fade into unfamiliar territory. Something nagged at the back of her mind, a warning bell muffled by an encroaching fog of drowsiness. This wasn't the way to Sophie's house, but before she could voice her concern, darkness crept in at the edges of her vision, and Jessica slipped into a deep, unnatural sleep. The last thing she registered was the setting sun on the horizon, its fiery glow a silent witness to the unfolding mystery of her life. Jessica's consciousness slowly clawed its way back through layers of fog. Her eyelids fluttered open, heavy and uncooperative. The world around her swam into focus, unfamiliar and disorienting. Gone were the soft contours of her bedroom, replaced by the cramped confines of what she gradually recognized as their holiday camper. The realization hit her like a bucket of ice water. This wasn't Sophie's house. This wasn't even their neighborhood. Through the small window, she could see dense forest pressing in on all sides, the last vestiges of twilight painting the sky in deep purples and blues. Panic surged through her veins, chasing away the last remnants of drowsiness. "Mom? Dad?" she called out, her voice hoarse and unfamiliar to her own ears. Catherine and James appeared in her field of vision, their faces etched with a mixture of concern and guilt. The sight of them, so familiar, yet suddenly so alien, sent a chill down Jessica's spine. "What is this?" Jessica demanded, struggling to sit up. Her limbs felt leaden, uncooperative. "Why are we here? You're supposed to drive me to Sophie's house?" James sat on the edge of the small camper bed, his weight causing the entire vehicle to shift slightly. "We just wanted to spend some time with you, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle but strained. "After the argument, we felt like we all needed to get away from home for a bit." Catherine nodded, perching on a nearby chair. "You fell asleep on the way here," she added. "You must have been very tired." Jessica's mind raced, pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve falling into place. "I wasn't tired," she said slowly, her eyes narrowing. "It's nowhere near my bedtime. There was something in that water you gave me, wasn't there?" Catherine's face paled. "What nonsense is this?" she said, her voice rising an octave. "We're your parents, Jessica. We would never hurt you like that." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of how wrong this all felt. "Whatever this is," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I promised Sophie I'd go to her house. I can't just leave her waiting. I want to go home." She made to stand up to push past her parents and out of this claustrophobic space. But as she moved, James's hand shot out, gripping her arm with unexpected force. "Jessica," he said, his voice low and serious, "we know you saw the wanted person image in the newspaper. It's not what you think. We only did this for your own good." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jessica's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, though a part of her already knew the answer. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "We need to tell you something, Jessica. Something we should have told you a long time ago." And so, in the cramped confines of the camper, with the forest pressing in around them like a living thing, Jessica's parents began to unravel the lie that had been her entire life. They spoke of a trafficking ring, of an orphanage, of a 2-year-old girl with fiery red hair and a scarred face. They spoke of their desperate desire for a child, of the illegal adoption that had brought Jessica into their lives. They spoke of a fire in a warehouse, of kidnappers who wanted to dispose of a damaged child, of their decision to save her and raise her as their own. Each word was like a physical blow, shattering Jessica's understanding of herself, her family, her entire world. She listened in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what she was hearing. When they finished, the silence in the camper was deafening. Jessica could hear her own heartbeat, loud and erratic in her ears. She looked at the people she had called Mom and Dad her entire life, seeing them as if for the first time. "So," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm really her. The girl in the newspaper, Jenny Clark." James nodded, his face a mask of anguish. "Yes," he said simply. Jessica felt as if she were floating outside her own body, watching this scene unfold from a distance. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell me all this time? This isn't saving me. This is lying to me for years." "We were afraid," Catherine said, reaching out to touch Jessica's hand. Jessica flinched away from the contact. "We were afraid we'd lose you." Jessica let out a bitter laugh. "So you don't trust me? The person you claim to love most in the world? Family is supposed to trust each other, Dad. They don't keep secrets like this." She stood up, her legs shaky but holding her weight. "I want to go to the police," she said. "I want to find my real family." James shook his head vehemently. "We can't do that, Jessica. You were from an orphanage. You don't have any family out there. The police would just put you back into the system. Is that what you want? You're only 12, still a minor." As if on cue, Jessica felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. She pulled it out, seeing a notification for a new message. It was a reply to the text she had sent earlier to the number from the missing person ad. Her heart racing, Jessica looked up at James and Catherine. "Someone's been putting those notices in the newspaper," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Someone out there is looking for me. Someone who cares enough to keep searching after 10 years. The orphanage wouldn't do that." The look of panic that crossed her parents' faces told Jessica everything she needed to know. In that moment, she realized that her life as she knew it was over. The atmosphere in the camper shifted, tension crackling like electricity in the air. James and Catherine exchanged a look of unbridled panic, their faces draining of color. "You did what?" James's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a shout. "You texted the number." Before Jessica could react, James lunged forward, snatching the phone from her hands. With a swift, violent motion, he hurled it against the camper wall. The sound of shattering glass and plastic echoed in the small space. Jessica stared at the broken remains of her phone, her heart shattering along with it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They were here in this remote camper area for a reason. They had planned this, to keep her away from the world, from the truth. Tears welled up in her eyes, a mixture of anger, fear, and heartbreak. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "All these years, everything was a lie." The tense silence was suddenly broken by a sharp knock on the camper door. All three of them froze, eyes wide with surprise and fear. "Hello?" a gruff voice called from outside. "Is everything all right in there? We don't usually see folks out here this time of year." Jessica's mind raced. This was her chance. Before James or Catherine could stop her, she bolted for the door, wrenching it open. The cool night air hit her face as she stumbled out, coming face to face with an older man. The campground owner, she realized. His weathered face creased with concern as he took in her disheveled appearance and tear-stained cheeks. "Please," Jessica gasped, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Help me. Call 911, my parents. They kidnapped me. They're not my real parents." The man's eyes widened in shock, darting between Jessica and the stunned faces of James and Catherine in the camper doorway. In that moment of confusion, James and Catherine made a split-second decision. They pushed past Jessica, running into the darkness of the forest. "Hey!" the campground owner shouted after them, but they had already disappeared into the shadows. He turned back to Jessica, his face softening with compassion. "Come on, let's get you inside. We'll call the police right away." Jessica allowed herself to be led to the camping house lobby, her mind whirling. The events of the past few hours felt like a surreal dream, or nightmare. As they entered the warmly lit lobby, the contrast with the dark, cramped camper was stark. Jessica sank into a plush armchair, her legs finally giving out. The campground owner, who introduced himself as Mr. Thompson, quickly called the police. Jessica could hear his low, urgent voice as he explained the situation. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. 2 police officers arrived first, their faces serious as they took in the scene. Jessica recounted her story, her voice shaking but determined. She told them about the newspaper, the revelation in the camper, the text message she had sent, and how James and Catherine had fled into the forest. The officers exchanged a quick glance. One of them immediately reached for his radio, his voice crisp and authoritative. "Dispatch, this is Officer Martinez. We need additional units to the Whispering Pines campground. 2 suspects have fled into the surrounding forest, requesting a search team and perimeter setup." The radio crackled with a swift response. "Copy that, Officer Martinez. Additional units are en route. K9 unit is also being dispatched." Jessica watched as the second officer stepped outside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he scanned the tree line. The campground, once peaceful, now buzzed with tension and urgency. Officer Martinez turned back to Jessica, his face softening. "Don't worry," he assured her. "We've got teams searching for them now, and we're setting up a perimeter around the entire campground. They won't get far." As if to emphasize his words, more police cars began to arrive, their lights painting the night in flashes of red and blue. Jessica watched through the lobby window as officers spread out, some heading into the forest with flashlights while others began to secure the campground exits. One of the newly arrived officers approached Jessica. "We're going to take you to the station now to sort this out," he said kindly. "Is there anyone you'd like us to contact for you?" Jessica thought for a moment. "My friend Sophie," she said. "I was supposed to go to her house tonight. She must be worried sick." The officer nodded, promising to make the call. As they led Jessica to the police car, she felt a strange mix of emotions: fear of the unknown future, relief at finally knowing the truth, and a glimmer of hope that perhaps her real family was out there, waiting for her. As the police car pulled away from the campground, Jessica watched the forest recede in the rearview mirror. The life she had known was disappearing along with it, but ahead lay the promise of answers, of truth, of her real identity. Despite the uncertainty, Jessica felt a surge of determination. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on. The car sped through the night, carrying Jessica towards a future she never could have imagined. As the lights of the city began to appear on the horizon, Jessica closed her eyes, sending a silent prayer into the universe. Somewhere out there, she hoped, was a family, her real family, who had never stopped looking for her. And now, finally, she was looking for them too. The police station hummed with activity as Jessica was led through its fluorescent-lit corridors. The smell of coffee and paper hung in the air, mingling with the underlying tension of a place where life-changing events were a daily occurrence. For Jessica, it felt like stepping into another world, one where the truth she had just discovered would finally be acknowledged and dealt with. Two kind-faced officers escorted her inside, their presence oddly comforting in this strange new world she found herself in. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they led her down a corridor and into a small interview room. "Have a seat, Jessica," one of the officers said gently. "We just need to ask you a few questions." Jessica nodded, sinking into the hard plastic chair. She recounted her story once again, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. She told them about the newspaper, the confrontation with her parents, the revelations in the camper. When she mentioned the text message she'd sent to the number in the missing person ad, the officers exchanged a significant look. "You said you found this number in the newspaper?" one officer asked, jotting down notes. Jessica nodded. "Yes, it was in the missing person section. There was a photo of a girl who looked just like me." The officer nodded, his pen scratching across the notepad. "We'll need to look into that. Can you show us the message?" Jessica's face fell. "My father threw it against the wall when he found out I texted the number, but I remember parts of the reply. It was from someone named Samantha Clark. She said she was Jenny Clark's sister." The officers exchanged another look. One of them stood up. "I'll get someone to reach out to this Samantha Clark. We should bring her in if possible." As one officer left the room, the other turned back to Jessica. "We're going to run your name through our system, Jessica. Or should we use Jenny?" Jessica hesitated. The name Jenny still felt foreign to her, but something about it resonated deep within her. Maybe try both," she suggested. The officer nodded, tapping away at a computer. After a few moments, he looked up, his expression serious. "It seems there are some inconsistencies in your records before the age of 3. This corroborates your story." Jessica felt a mix of vindication and sadness wash over her. Can you find out who my real parents are?" she asked hesitantly. The officer's face softened. "I'm sorry, Jessica, but I'm afraid we have some bad news. According to our records, you and your older sister were brought to the orphanage as very young children. There's no information about your parents. You were found abandoned on the street." The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. She had hoped, somewhere deep inside, that uncovering her true identity might lead her to her real parents. But it seemed that door was closed before it had even fully opened. Just then there was a knock at the door. Another officer entered, his expression grave. "We've located and arrested Mr. and Mrs. Fisher," he reported. "They're being processed now and will be brought in for questioning shortly." Jessica nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Despite everything, a part of her still cared for James and Catherine. They had raised her, after all. But the lies, the kidnapping, it was all too much. Before she could dwell on these conflicting emotions, the door opened again. This time, a young woman entered, accompanied by another officer. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The woman looked so much like her, the same fiery red hair, the same green eyes, but where Jessica's face bore scars, this woman's was smooth and unblemished. "Jenny?" the woman whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Jessica stood up, her legs shaky. "Are you Samantha?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. The woman nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. In 2 quick strides, she crossed the room and enveloped Jessica in a tight hug. "Oh, Jenny," she sobbed, "I've been looking for you for so long." Jessica returned the hug, feeling both strange and oddly right. As they pulled apart, Samantha kept her hands on Jessica's shoulders, looking at her intently. "You probably don't remember me," Samantha said softly. "You were only 2 when you disappeared. I was 8. Jessica shook her head. "I'm sorry, I don't remember anything from before. Before James and Catherine." Samantha's expression darkened at the mention of those names, but she quickly softened. "It's okay, we have time now." The officers allowed them a moment before gently interrupting. "We'd like to conduct a DNA test to confirm your relationship," one of them explained. "Is that all right with both of you?" Both Jessica and Samantha nodded their agreement. A technician was called in, and swab samples were quickly collected from both of them. As the technician collected the samples and mentioned they would be ready in the next 12 hours, Samantha turned to Jessica, her expression serious. "I need to tell you more about our past," she began. "We grew up in the orphanage together." Jessica frowned, trying to process this new information. "I don't remember that," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Samantha continued, her gaze softening. "Neither of us remembers our parents, but I always took care of you. When you disappeared, I never stopped looking for you." Jessica felt tears welling up in her eyes. "You've been putting those ads in the newspaper all this time?" Samantha nodded. "I started as soon as I was old enough to have a job. I've been saving up, putting out ads every year on your birthday. I couldn't bear the thought of you out there, not knowing who you really were." A child services worker entered the room, explaining that they would need to make arrangements for Jessica's care. Samantha immediately spoke up. "I have my own apartment," she said. "I'm 18 now, I have a job, I can take care of Jenny." The worker nodded, making notes. "We'll need to go through a vetting process, but given the circumstances, that does seem like the best option." As the night wore on, Jessica felt overwhelmed by the whirlwind of events. Her entire world had been turned upside down in the span of a day. She had lost the parents she thought were hers and gained a sister she never knew she had. From the interview room, Jessica could hear the sound of a police siren approaching. She went to the window and saw a police car pulling up. 2 officers got out, escorting James and Catherine in handcuffs. Jessica felt her heart constrict at the sight. These people had raised her, loved her, cared for her. They had also lied to her, kidnapped her, kept her from her true identity. The conflicting emotions were almost too much to bear. Samantha came to stand beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be okay, Jenny," she said softly. "We're together now. We'll figure this out." As the evening wore on, Jessica realized that this was just the beginning. The events of the past 24 hours played through her mind like a surreal movie. The world as she had known it had shattered, only to be rebuilt in a way she never could have imagined. The weight of these revelations pressed heavily on her shoulders, yet there was also a strange sense of lightness, the lightness of truth finally unveiled. She absently traced the scar on her face, the mark that had defined so much of her life. For years she had believed it to be the result of a tragic accident, a reminder of the parents who had saved her. Now, she realized, it was something else entirely. A symbol of a life stolen, of truths hidden, of a family separated. Yet as she glanced at Samantha sitting nearby, the scar felt less like a burden and more like a connection to this newfound sister, a visible thread in the tapestry of their shared history. Jessica's thoughts turned to James and Catherine. Despite the anger and betrayal she felt, a part of her heart ached for them. They had raised her, loved her, been there for every skinned knee and every triumph. Their actions were unforgivable, yet she couldn't deny the years of care and affection. The complexity of her emotions towards them was a burden she knew she would carry for a long time to come. As she stood there on the precipice of her new life, Jessica realized that her journey was far from over. There would be legal battles, emotional hurdles, and a whole new identity to come to terms with. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with both promise and challenge. But for the first time in her life, Jessica felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The truth, as painful and disorienting as it had been, had also set her free. She was no longer living a life built on lies, no matter how well-intentioned those lies might have been.